My name is Anna Pippus. I'm a lawyer and director of the Plant-Based Policy Center.
So I believe you're aware of what's happening with the prison farms, the return of prison farms to Canada, beginning in Kingston, Ontario, and our government's intention is to establish an intensive prison dairy operation involving 1,500 goats and a number of cows as well, reportedly to supply infant formula for international markets. And we represent Evolve Our Prison Farms, advocates an ethical model for the prison farms that upholds prisoner justice, animal justice, and environmental justice. And we feel that this is an opportunity for our government to take a proactive approach and model farming for the future, climate change solutions, and provide programming that is relevant to prisoner rehabilitation and meaningful work opportunities. And we are concerned about this model. And perhaps, what are your thoughts on what is happening, and what concerns do you have?
That is an enormous question. I think our government's approach in general towards animal farming and the related issues of worker justice and environmental justice has typically been quite disappointing across all of the different areas. So let's maybe go through them. When it comes to how animals are being treated, farmed animals in Canada, last year in 2018, we killed 800 million farmed animals for food. Pretty much across the board, they experienced suffering, psychological and physical suffering, before we killed them. So really, this is an enormous ethical issue that the government is really refusing to touch. So our federal government doesn't actually regulate animal farming, animal welfare and animal farming. The federal government gets involved with the transportation of animals and the slaughter of animals, but that's really such a microscopic part of their entire lives. They're not actually regulating the conditions that animals are kept in from a welfare point of view on farms. So when it comes to standards, what can you do to the animals, what is not permitted, what are the standard practices, that is entirely set by the agricultural industry itself. And when it comes to oversight of the farms, that's also done by the animal agriculture industry. Many people are surprised to learn that the government is not actually setting standards for animal welfare on farms or overseeing it at all. And we know from undercover investigations, many of them now, that the system is simply not working. The standards themselves are deficient. They allow unconscionable cruelty to animals. There's no denying from a science-based point of view that animals do suffer. We keep them in barren conditions. We deprive them of fresh air, of natural lighting, of the freedom to move, of natural social groupings. The list goes on. These are really terrible situations. By the time that they're sent to slaughter, animals are really in terrible shape, so much so that many of them die en route to slaughter. Millions of them actually die or arrive at slaughterhouses so ill that they have to be condemned, not put into the human food chain. And so the federal government's response to this is wholly inadequate. They're not stepping in to regulate it, but instead they're funding the agricultural industry's own creation of its own standards, and that's simply not good enough. We know it's not working.
One of the things about the prison farm in Kingston is that they have an on-site slaughterhouse where prisoners are trained in slaughtering and butchering animals. Now, one of the statements that we've received from one of our experts, Kelly Struthers-Montford, she made the comment that this kind of engaging prisoners in slaughterhouse work necessitates that prisoners engage in behaviors that would be criminalized if done to humans or to animals not legally categorized as food. And I believe that there is a parallel here between setting aside a category of animals that don't have the same kind of rights or perceptions in the public eye because they're categorized as food animals, that they don't have the rights to their bodies, to their babies, the way that we would afford to certain other animals or companion animals, for example, or wildlife. And I believe that there's a parallel there also to the perception towards prisoners, and that they don't have the right to meaningful opportunities and healing opportunities. And so I sort of see there's a kind of a cross-section between our perception of food animals and the treatment that they receive, and our perceptions towards prisoners and the treatment that they receive.
Yeah, there's so much there. Let's unpack it a little bit. So Agricultural work in Canada is notoriously difficult, and that's especially true of slaughterhouse work. It is very, very difficult to find workers to slaughter animals. Typically, it's filled by migrant workers, and sometimes slaughterhouses can't even actually fill the roles that they have. And this has been an ongoing problem in recent years of the processing industry trying to find solutions to be able to staff its kill plants. And that's because the work is dangerous. It's emotionally challenging, very hard to be killing animals. It's also physically demanding. The workers suffer from repetitive stress motions. They're doing the same motion day after day in many cases in the processing line in a very cold environment, and it's associated with a whole host of worker violations and worker problems. So to be putting a slaughterhouse inside a prison and essentially forcing the prisoners who really don't have a choice, or if they do have a choice, it's a very limited form of choice, to do this work is really exploitative. Prisoners are very frequently caught up in the criminal justice system, not because they're horrible, evil people, but because they have experienced many forms of marginalization prior to where they've become today. And so to marginalize them further by exploiting them to do this work that no Canadians want to do is really taking advantage of people in a tough spot and making their situation even worse. We know that when slaughterhouses move into a town, the rates of violence in that town increase. And that's independent of the violence that may have been happening there before. There's a direct correlation. The slaughterhouse goes in and the violent crime goes up. And that really tells us that slaughtering animals causes people to be violent. So it just seems so wrong-headed to be taking prisoners, people who are supposedly in prison for a period of rehabilitation, and asking them to take lives, to kill animals, even if it is for a purpose that currently as a society we consider to be acceptable. There's still no denying that turning a living animal into a meat product requires killing them, and somebody needs to do that work. And when that person is somebody who we want to rehabilitate from participating in violent crimes, it's really sending very mixed messages.
It seems the most unintuitive and counterproductive possibility for a work and reintegration program for prisoners. I'm not sure how much lower the bar could be set.
Of course, and it's so ironic that, for some of these people, they could even be incarcerated for crimes that involved animals themselves. They could be in prison for animal cruelty, or animal cruelty could be one of the charges caught up. Sometimes animal cruelty can be related to domestic violence, or there's other ways that there could be intersections there. And so it sends a very mixed message. Now, the only difference really between the animal cruelty that horrifies us against cats and dogs, that'll be in the news and the entire public will condemn it, and the type of cruelty that we routinely inflict on cows, pigs, and chickens is our perception. The cruelty really doesn't differ all that much. It's much more reflective of our own confusion about how we're thinking about ethical issues, and to be transferring that confusion onto people who really need much more empathetic leadership on how to be well-adjusted members of society is really just taking a bad situation and making it worse rather than repairing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have had some people argue that this kind of work, so dairy work or slaughterhouse work, will only really be harmful to prisoners if they see it as harming animals. And if they don't see this as harmful towards animals, it will not have a harmful impact on them. And our response to that has been that in order to not see that as harmful to animals requires emotional desensitization. And that is actually the exact opposite of what rehabilitation should be accomplishing.
I think that's exactly right. I think to the extent that people who are working in animal agriculture aren't registering the distress that animals are in, that's not a cause to celebrate. That is a cause to be very concerned. If people are working with animals who are clearly suffering physically and psychologically, and in farming situations, for the most part, they are, in big ways and small, whether it's the separation of mothers and babies on a dairy farm, whether it's confining egg-laying hens in cages so small and so barren that they go crazy from the confinement and start fighting one another, and they get trapped in the cage when they try to escape, to the pigs also confined in these very barren conditions. And the same thing with beef cows being subjected to hot branding that causes third-degree burns. So, and of course, ultimately at the end, they go to a slaughterhouse to be killed in ways that none of us would want to be killed in, none of us would subject our beloved cats and dogs to. And so to the extent that somebody is not perceiving that as being harmful, I don't think that's a victory. I think that's deeply troubling.
I believe that it also reflects, in a rehabilitation program, what we want to be teaching is empathy, connectedness with something outside of yourself. We've heard from former prison farm workers who said that working with cows, for example, really taught them empathy and the ability to care for something other than themselves, and someone who can love and not judge them for being a prisoner. And we see prisoners benefiting from that, forming bonds with animals and building relationships of trust with animals. And we feel that it's a real abuse towards not only the animals, but to the prisoners also, to be requiring them to continually form and break bonds of affection and trust. So, of course, Evolve Our Prison Farms, as you know, we've proposed a sanctuary model of care as animal-assisted therapy on the prison farms. And we feel that as a federal program that there should be some standards around the use of animals in a federal program, and that they should, especially in a rehabilitative context, follow an animal therapy model. And of course, animal agriculture is not a model of animal therapy.
Totally. It's perverse to, on the one hand, encourage somebody to develop a deep, meaningful relationship with an animal, and then on the other hand, have them turn around and kill that animal for the sake of essentially profit, for no real good reason at all. And we shouldn't expect that to work. Why should that work? Why should having somebody develop a deep bond with some being, whether it's an animal or whoever else, and then sort of turn on them and betray their trust? That is a recipe for disaster. That should be so obvious.
Yes, and we've seen, on the former prison farms, which people really loved. They loved the former prison farms, and a lot of the prisoners talked about how successful it was. People in the community, especially around the prisons in Kingston, said these programs work. There is also a dark undercurrent, however. Despite the benefits that there were reports of abuse of cows and chickens. That wasn't the standard, but it did occur, that there were abuses, physical and sexual abuses towards the animals. We've heard this from prisoners as well as prison staff. And that is in addition to the systematic abuse of animals, which most people don't see. They don't see dairy or the meat industries as a form of systematic abuse against animals.
It's invisible in plain sight.
Precisely. And we are concerned, and now that the prison farms are coming back, they are coming back bigger than ever. Not better, bigger, in terms of animal agriculture. So at Joyceville, there's going to be an intensive prison goat dairy operation with 1,500 goats. Apparently this will be a fully indoor operation, and it'll be a continuous sort of carousel of milking and batch after batch after batch after batch. Very impersonal, no real meaningful opportunities for bonding with animals. No real opportunities to recognize the individuality of each of these animals. And when we've talked to corrections and asked what kind of oversight will there be, what kind of protections will there be against abuse? Well, because it's corrections, they can't say where or if there will be cameras. It's all very secretive, it's all very close to the public eye. And it seems that there should be higher standards in a federal program like this then even there would be, now people are talking out on farms or slaughterhouses in the public, that there should be cameras to protect against abuse outside of the systematic abuse, to protect against these isolated incidents of abuse. And yet in the prison situation, it's that much harder to have transparency and to have accountability. What options do we have at a policy level to address the risks towards the animals and towards the prisoners working with them?
The lack of transparency when it comes to animal farming in prisons and outside of prisons is generally an enormous problem. The government has shown no real appetite to oversee or to otherwise hold animal farming accountable, to hold it to standards, to oversee, to ensure that there are checks and balances. And that, I think, really reflects a broader societal attitude of not really taking the plight of animals very seriously, despite the fact that there are so many hundreds of millions of them in our farming system, and despite the fact that their ability to suffer emotionally and physically is no different than our own, whatever you may think about the moral standing of animals in our community. So the fact that the government has shown, generally speaking, such a disinterest in overseeing animals is really part of a broader trend. So it's communicating the values that animals don't matter, that even prisoners don't matter, that this is just not a very important issue, and that it seems like what's really going on here is probably just an interest in putting the prisoners to work in order to earn some money. And there's probably very little consideration, actually, of the animal welfare implications or of the psychological implications for the workers. I think when it comes to talking about solutions like putting in cameras, I have mixed feelings about that, and that's because I think sometimes these types of solutions really are not getting at the root cause. Look, animals are not being treated badly because we don't have cameras in slaughterhouses. That's just not what's going on here. Animals are being treated badly because we're farming far too many of them, because we're killing them on these fast-moving slaughter lines, because workers must, of necessity, become desensitized to the work. I've worked with many undercover investigators, many of whom have also worked in slaughterhouses over the course of their undercover investigations career, and not a single one of them has said that during the course of their employment in a slaughterhouse that they found it challenging the whole time. No, it only takes a matter of weeks before they become desensitized to the animals, and then they too are annoyed when an animal is fighting for their life, frustrated when the animal poops himself in fear. It's very challenging. It's very challenging for any human to maintain empathy while also being engaged in slaughter work. It's just simply too much for our brains to compute. And so I think that the idea of putting in cameras or otherwise adding interim solutions or sort of moderate solutions, but ultimately maintaining the status quo, this is really not going to solve the problem. It may even worsen the problem just by providing a sense of placation that, don't worry, this is being dealt with. But the reality is that when we have security cameras, nobody's reviewing them unless there's an incident. JBS Swift, one of the largest meat packing plants in the world, has been live streaming its slaughter operations from the US for many years, and it hasn't made a difference. Of course, because why would it? Nobody is going out of their way to look up slaughterhouse footage. None of us want to see that. Nobody is really interested in watching live slaughter footage for even a minute, let alone hours on end, to see if they can document any problems.
One interesting story that I came across in talking to prisoners, so I went into Joyceville Institution and I spoke with some people there, and one prisoner there told a story. I had visited the slaughterhouse there. I needed to see it. Does this thing actually exist? We have people to this day saying, no, surely. And if it is still there, they surely don't still train prisoners there. But we know that they do, and that's been confirmed from CSC as well. So we know that prisoners are continuing to work on a small scale, not a lot, but they are still trained there. Even one prisoner working in a slaughterhouse is inappropriate. And I noticed that, they have the carousel leading into the slaughterhouse, so it's sort of a curving corral, and so animals are sort of funneled through there into that process. And it was state-of-the-art, nice brand new corral. And I mentioned that to the prisoner, like, that looks like a pretty fancy thing that they've got there. And he says, oh, it's brand new, they just put that in. And I said, why? And he said, because last year a cow escaped from the slaughterhouse ramp and it broke through the corral, and it was gone for, I believe it was 2 weeks. They could not find the cow, and they searched everywhere for it, and finally, after 2 weeks, they spotted the cow outside of the prison tennis court there, and a bunch of prisoners got together and kind of corralled it into the tennis court, and it still took them 2 days further to rope it because it would charge at them in self-defense every time they tried to approach. So it was just a massive undertaking to try to recapture this escaped cow. And he said that after they captured it, everybody, the prisoners, the staff, and the farmer whose cow it originally was, all felt that it would not be appropriate to send that cow to slaughter now, because it had fought so hard to live and survived all that time on its own, on her own. And I feel that if you look at the individual animal, What animal agriculture does is it erases the individual in vast numbers, and that is also a parallel of prisoners. The individual person, human being, is erased under this label of prisoner and grouped together, and your value depends on your productivity and your profitability, and that is the exact same way that we treat food animals. Your value is only insofar as you are productive and profitable. But our proposal for a sanctuary model will teach that reverence for life at the foundation of it, that every life is valuable. And if we can teach prisoners that through caring for animals without being required to harm them as part of that process, what that means about their own life and their own value, and it just makes sense.
For most of us, when we hear about an animal fighting for their lives and escaping a slaughter situation, most of us are rooting for the animal. Most of us care deeply about that kind of situation. You know, these types of stories are in the news every once in a while, and they're big news stories because they're interesting to us. They speak to us on a very deep human level. We can relate to that. We can relate to the idea of fighting for our lives, and I think there's a spark in each of us that resonates with that recognizes that that killing animals doesn't sit well with us, and that, of course, if we were in their situation, we would be fighting for our lives too. And I think that the fact that we're all rooting for the animal speaks volumes to what our true values are. They're just buried under layers of conditioning and tradition and confusion and propaganda that make it very hard to think clearly about these issues. With so much land in such a prime, fertile, growing region of Canada, such as that would be a perfect spot for putting in some plant crops, for doing some gardening that could support the prison food program, for providing homes for farmed animals who need a place to live out their lives. Just like we have shelters for cats and dogs, so are there farm sanctuaries for the cows, pigs, chickens, turkeys, ducks, other animals who somehow manage to survive and escape from the farming model and not get sent to slaughter. And that would be, I think, a much more worthwhile model to be imparting the values that we want to impart to people, which are that we should have empathy for all of our fellow sentient creatures, that we should teach people with respect, that we should move gently through the earth, that we should treat others the way that we want to be treated, that we should not kill unnecessarily. So all of these values, I think, are much better supported by a sanctuary model. And then when it comes to I think the idea that putting in a dairy operation would help build skills, I would counter that there are many other skills that we can teach. Let's say by growing plant-based foods, teaching people how to garden and grow food is a useful skill in our own lives. It can help us to lower our carbon footprint by growing some of our own food. It can keep our grocery bill down. It can cause us to get excited about eating our fruits and vegetables, which we know that all Canadians need to do more of, and especially in the prison population we're talking about, this is precisely the demographic that does need to be eating more fruits and vegetables. To the extent that the goat dairy operation is appealing to the prison because it would help bring in some money, well, farming the land for plant crops would help bring down the food costs of the prison operation. So it seems like there are other sensible approaches if the goals are to bring down prison operation costs, to teach employable and personal skills, and to build empathy. There's probably a better way of accomplishing that, and that's just one example. I'm sure there are others.
Absolutely. Well, we know that the government has allocated $4.3 million over 5 years to reestablish the prison farms just in Kingston. And we also know that the majority of those funds are going to be used simply to build the infrastructure for a large-scale animal operation and to purchase an enormous number of animals to feed that operation. So right there, that is the bulk of the funding for the program. And if they were to do simply innovative plant-based green agriculture, you could do it at a tiny fraction of the cost. And if you had, say, a 30-cow or a small sanctuary model, you could have all the benefits of animal therapy at a small fraction of the cost versus 1,000 or more animals and the veterinary care and the dairy infrastructure, the bulk dairy coolers, the pipeline to the buyer, and apparently it will probably be infant formula for international markets, which also brings into question the ethics of prison labor, because in Canada it's never been used in this way. And we know prisoners don't want it. We know Canadians don't want it. and yet the government seems determined to move forward. So we need to push really hard to hold our government to task and demand that they take a forward-thinking approach and an ethical approach to this, because it's unsustainable financially, ethically, environmentally. It is a misperception that in order for a farm to make money, it has to be animal agriculture. We've encountered this, but that's actually completely false. We know animal agriculture has razor-thin margins, if none at all. If you took away subsidies out of animal agriculture, it is not a money-making industry. But green agriculture is booming, the markets are growing, social consciousness is evolving, and we feel that it's time for our prison farms to reflect that very evolution.
We also have to look at some of the externalized costs of animal agriculture, because it's really not just a straightforward calculation of how much does this cost and how much is this bringing in. We know that animal farming requires far more environmental resources, and that's mostly because, quite simply, because to house and keep animals alive for the many weeks or months or years of their life is much more intensive than just simply growing the plant crops and eating them directly. We're feeding them to animals on an ongoing basis, and so it requires much more land, more water, more pesticides and fertilizers that are used on the feed crops. There's pollution in the form of manure, greenhouse gases. So there's a whole mess of environmental problems that are related to animal farming that are going to be very costly. Animal farming is a leading contributor to global warming, which is poised to cost Canada alone tens of billions of dollars over the next few decades. And internationally, we're really looking at bankrupting the world if we don't reverse course and stop emitting so many greenhouse gases. One of the key behavioral changes that policy experts have identified is reducing the number of animals that we're farming. So certainly the last thing we should be doing is investing millions of federal dollars in building infrastructure to increase our capacity to do this. All of the other issues with that aside.
It's interesting because at the same time as our government is putting in this prison dairy operation and using these millions of dollars to subsidize and support that program, they're putting, I think it was $150 million recently into the pea protein industry in Canada. So they recognize that this is the trend of the future and this is where markets are heading. And it's almost as if our government is experiencing a bit of a crisis of identity at the moment.
Our government typically does not do a great job of talking to one another across departments, so often the right hand isn't really fully on board with what the left hand is doing, and we very often see this in the case of animal agriculture, because animal agriculture is often antithetical to the work that Health Canada is doing, for example. So Health Canada has finally come out now against the wishes of the animal agriculture industry and said we all need to eat far less meat, we need to eat far fewer animal products, and we need to be eating much more plant-based foods, fruits, vegetables, and especially plant-based proteins. That was fought long and hard by the animal agriculture industry. The agriculture department held its own hearings trying to get the government to tell Health Canada that it couldn't do that it needed to factor in the economic position of the animal agriculture industry, which would have been at the expense of the health of Canadians. This is not terribly unusual within government, and it's disappointing, but there is corruption. And a lot of it is because of industries that have a lot of money at stake, because their industries stand to lose if some sort of new legislation is going to threaten it. They can afford to hire lobbyists. They're hosting barbecues and they're appearing in the offices of MPs making a fantastic case for themselves about, whereas on the other hand, the environment, the animals, we're really not showing up in the same numbers or with the same sophistication because we're just simply nonprofit organizations or really everyday people who are concerned about our families but who don't have necessarily the political sophistication we need to be making the counter case. And then there's also the added complication of these industries being able to support politicians in other ways, in financial ways, or, you know, there's a lot of ways that as democratic as Canada can be, that there is corruption in the process and ability for industries to exploit the political process for their own gain, which often comes at the expense of the public.
Yeah, it's interesting that for the first time, Canada's food guide, revising the food guide, they explicitly prohibited industry from having a seat at the table and lobbying for their economic interests. They wanted the revision of the food guide to be based solely on the best evidence, the best scientific evidence for human health and planetary health.
Well, what they said is, industry, you can participate in the regular public consultation process. And I just need to correct that, because industry had gone crying to the federal government and said, Health Canada refused to hear our concerns. We haven't had a chance to air our concerns about how this is going to affect us. And I have to say, that's not true at all. They were simply invited along with the rest of the public to submit their particular concerns that would be aggregated during the public consultation process. But they weren't given special treatment over the rest of us or over nonprofit organizations.
And so what we're seeing with the prison farms, in comparison, and prisons follow Canada's food guide. So
Yes,
all the
they
more
do.
reason, again, for prison farms to follow the recommendations of the new food guide, and that prison farms should reflect that. And yet, the advisory panel that was established to advise on the direction that the prison farms would take, the majority of the panel were representatives of beef and dairy industries. So we feel that there is a conflict of interest, and that we would like to see what is happening with the food guide about being independent, to recognize, to listen to everybody, but to have an objective, evidence-based approach. And the Trudeau government is all about evidence-based decisions. They say they are. And what we're seeing with the prison farms is the very opposite, that all the evidence points against what they're doing, all the evidence points towards what we're proposing. And yet there's just this barrier, this wall that we keep butting our heads up against just to be heard. And that's why we're talking to people like you, because we feel that as a national program, this deserves a conversation. It's a federal program, and this will have implications on society, on our approach to rehabilitation, on our treatment of our environment. And so we feel that there's a necessity to have that conversation and to push our government to hear our voices and to recognize that the winning move, the only way to win this in the long term, is to recognize that this is the direction that the world is taking, and be proactive instead of lagging behind and having to play catch up afterwards.
Some are going to understand the issues right away and are going to be enthusiastic about coming on board. And like always, some people are going to drag their heels and create barriers to preventing progress to happen. And for the most part, there's value in the political process having some enthusiastic trailblazers and having some others putting the brakes on it, and that helps things move forward at a good tempo. The problem with animal farming is that it's quite urgent. We're running out of time when it comes to the planet in particular. Certainly many animals are suffering now, prisoners are suffering now. So I think we probably need to be upping our level of urgency when it comes to looking at our policy response across the departments when it comes to animal farming and all of its associated problems.
It's interesting because there was a Maclean's article about the new Canada Food Guide, and it concludes with, if you are one who has ignored the recommendations of the food guide in the past, consider giving this guide a go for the well-being not only of Canadians, but for the planet and the animals too. The government got it right this time. Mm-hmm. So yes. We would love to see the government get this one right too. And they're so well aligned. And you know, the prison farms in Kingston, it's local, it's sort of on a smaller scale, and a lot of people might wonder, well, what difference will that one thing make in the big picture? And I believe that it's all those little one things that add up to make that cumulative difference. And we have to push, not only because of the local impact, but the symbolic impact. We have to push our government to take every opportunity in every possible way to address the climate crisis and to progress, to do better each year at each opportunity. And that this opportunity is about to be lost, it's about to be squandered. Once they put this whole infrastructure in and bring in all these animals, it'll be very hard to reverse it. Prison farms really are representative. There's so many layers of justice that converge here. So we've got human rights, we've got animal rights, we've got environmental concerns, everything democratic. issues because the voices of the people and the prisoners are not being listened to?
It's really not reflective of what we the people want.
That's right. Now, why do you think the environmental movement has faced some criticism for largely leaving diet and animal agriculture out of the conversation? And I know David Suzuki was rather famous for saying that environmentalism has failed. And I wonder if a large part of it has been because of that reluctance to really be proactive and to acknowledge all the ways that our personal choices impact the environment, especially considering that animal agriculture is arguably the top 1, 2, or 3 causes of the most serious environmental problems and climate change. It should be front and center in the conversation. But I suppose it's very personal. There was one statement that was made in a recent article in Toronto Magazine: a wildly simple path to halting ecological collapse is right in front of our mouths. Why don't we talk about it more?
Animal farming is a leading contributor to climate change. That's not in dispute. Transportation and animal farming are the top 2 contributors to climate change. And just like with our compassion, our approach to climate change should not be either or. It shouldn't be, well, let's pick a problem and solve it. It's no, we need to include all of the top contributors. And so there's no question that we should have been talking about diet and its role in climate change many years ago. Fortunately, the tide is starting to turn now. We are increasingly seeing think tanks putting out policy reports linking diet to climate change, even showing why governments have failed in their policy responses and what they need to do to change things. We're seeing environmental organizations starting to talk about these issues. So we're seeing a growing number of environmentalists, of individuals identifying as environmentalists who are choosing to adopt a plant-based or a mostly plant-based diet out of concerns for the environment. So the message is starting to seep in there. I think when it comes to concern for animals, there's a very direct and obvious link between how animals are being treated and how we're eating. It's very simple to say, oh, well, I disagree with the nature of dairy farming, separating mothers from their babies, I'm going to boycott this industry. But I think it can be more challenging to draw the link between animal farming and climate change because it's not immediately apparent why it is that animal farming is so devastating to the environment. And it's for many complicated reasons, but largely because it's much less efficient to farm plant crops to feed to animals than it is to eat them directly. And so we're starting to understand that and to grasp it and to intuitively sense it. And I think another reason that it has been kind of slow to catch on is that diet is inherently personal. We are attached to certain ways of eating, to certain foods that we may have from our pasts or that may comfort us or provide a connection to our families in certain ways. And I do think it's important not to minimize the importance of food and the role that it plays in our lives and our identities and our cultures and our communities. But that said, that doesn't mean that we can just entirely ignore it. We have to have the hard conversation of how can we eat in a way that is going to enable life on Earth to continue.
That's the thing. It's not about judging anybody for anything, but rather now that we know more about what animal agriculture involves, and now that we know more about the impact that it has on our planet and our own health, how will we respond to that new knowledge?
And I think that the responsibility can't be on the individuals. The responsibility really must be primarily on governments. Governments need to set policies that make the good food choice the easy food choice. Governments need to set policies that ensure that we're able to go about our everyday lives without thinking too much about it, and we're able to access foods that are better for the environment. And government also needs to express leadership in telling us what we should be concerned about and why. Government puts up posters telling us to turn off the tap when we brush our teeth and has other public awareness campaigns and similarly uses various policy tools to guide our behavior in socially adaptive ways. But it has not started doing this yet when it comes to animal farming. And when we're talking about a prison farm, this is exactly the type of opportunity the government has to exhibit leadership, to say, all right, we've got this population, we need to put in some sort of work model, I suppose, if that is what's going on. what can it look like? How can we express leadership in a way that's reflective of what our society needs now environmentally, from a health point of view, from an animal point of view, from a worker point of view, from a prisoner rights point of view? So how can we create a model that is going to be progressive and forward-thinking and compassionate for a future?
Precisely. And it's a reflection of our treatment towards prisoners. Is this about punishment, or is this about rehabilitation and healing? And in order to protect public safety, we have to put the emphasis on healing and on correcting, teaching better choices and teaching empathy. I have to explain to my own son, who's now 6 years old, what a prison is. And I don't believe prisoners are bad people. I teach him everybody makes bad choices sometimes. Sometimes that bad choice is a bigger bad choice, and we need to learn how to make better choices. To me, that is the function of a prison, is to protect society and to teach how to make better choices. And if my child, like any child, makes a bad choice, the worst thing I can do is to stick him in a closet, lock him up in there, and say, by the time you come out of here, you'd better be a better person, make better choices.
And the irony is that a lot of the people who end up in the prison system, that's exactly the childhood that they have had. They've been deprived emotionally. They haven't had the warmth and the parental guidance that they really needed to flourish. And they are hurting, and they're turning to lives of crime out of emotional pain or out of poverty or out of any other related factors that really don't speak to their character or their worth as a human being. Not to take too extreme of a position, but as a lawyer who has thought about these issues for the last 10 or so years, I really question the value of prisons at all. If our goal is rehabilitation, we almost couldn't design a worse model than to lock them all up together, to deprive them of any freedom, any warmth, and to essentially tell them that they're subhuman. And then, of course, to be now making matters worse by expecting them to work for surely reduced wages.
At the top pay level after deductions, they'll be making up to $3 a day.
Right. And so this is inherently exploitative, and it's not something that they would choose to be doing, nor that they should be forced to be doing.
We have faced the argument that the reason that it should be a dairy operation at the prison is because a lot of prisoners have not known a mother's love, and all the animals in a dairy operation are mothers. So there's this distortion of what motherhood is, and this imposition of motherhood on animals, taking her offspring, and then taking that motherhood and somehow applying it to yourself and calling that a healing process.
Farmed animals are not surrogate mothers for prisoners. They're just not. Farmed animals are mothers against their will. They are impregnated against their will. They have their babies taken away from them at birth. That's part of the dairy model. That's why we're drinking the dairy and not their offspring. With cows, the calves typically become veal or dairy calves themselves. And it's the same thing with goats. The babies go on to become meat or future dairy goats. And so to say that, here, to hold this up as a model of motherhood that is going to somehow provide maternal warmth is quite perverse. There's nothing about the farmed animal motherhood that is worth celebrating or worth idealizing. It's really a mother's broken heart. And that mother does not want to be the mother for a human prisoner who's taking her milk to sell for whatever purpose. That mother wants to be with her own family, just like we all do.
There was one recent article in a magazine out of Ottawa when the government announced that it was going to be returning the farms and making them goat dairy operations, and there were going to be no cows involved. A number of people in the community objected very strongly to this, saying they wanted it to be dairy cows, not goats. And the argument that was made in this article was the statement that goats, after all, are not the soulful equivalent of cows. And I found this very disturbing to read. It's not based on evidence, it's not based on anything at all. It's rather disturbing. My response to that publicly was that exploiting and slaughtering animals is not the soulful equivalent of sanctuary. But truly, when people have experienced bonding with animals, any kind of animal, from a chipmunk to a bird, to a goat, to a cow, you realize that the experience is the same. And the capacity for love and the reciprocal relationship of mutual healing between humans and animals is universal.
I think that's exactly right. And then we can't lose sight of the fact that in a farming model, it always ends with the ultimate betrayal. It's time to evolve our prison farms.